Hello friends, I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is a pilot edition, a premiere of what will be my new monthly show at Newsbud, Tales from the Russian Intelligence. This pilot edition will be broadcast instead of my weekly show, Russian Newspapers Monitor, because I will go on a short but sweet summer vacation in the next couple days. This edition of the show will be provided in its entirety on YouTube. All the other editions will be for the Newsbud community members only. I hope you enjoyed the new show. I would like to ask you to consider becoming a member of the Newsbud community and supporting our work. The best is yet to come. In this edition, I will discuss a book published by the CIA veteran Tennent Pete Bagley entitled Spymaster, Startling Cold War Revelations of a KGB Spy Chief as revealed to his CIA agent friend. This book was published posthumously in 2015. Bagley died a year earlier at the age of 88. My focus in this edition will be on the revelations provided to Bagley by the KGB veteran Sergei Kondrashev, some of which, as you will see, are genuinely surprising. The author of the book, Tennent Pete Bagley, worked in the CIA from the early 1950s until the early 1970s. He was one of the most promising officers and was thought to have a great chance of eventually becoming the CIA director. However, in the early 1970s, Bagley was forced to leave the CIA because of the disagreement over the CIA's handling of the Yuri Nosenko case. Just like the longtime CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton, Bagley thought that Nosenko was not a bona fide defector, but a KGB dangle sent to confuse and disorient the CIA. The CIA leadership disagreed, fired both Bagley and Angleton, and took on Nosenko as a paid consultant. I wrote in detail about the issues involved in this case in my January 2017 Newsbud article, CIA, the Golitsyn-Nosenko affair, and the Russian TV series Traitors. I suggest you check it out. The book's preface is written by a veteran intelligence investigator, Edward J. Epstein. Epstein was Bagley's personal friend and first met him in 1977 while he was doing research for his book on Lee Harvey Oswald, published later under the title Legend, The Secret World of Lee Harvey Oswald. Epstein reports that after the end of the Cold War, Bagley became acquainted with one of the most famous spymasters of the 20th century, Markus Wolf, the head of the East German Foreign Intelligence Agency for more than 30 years. The French-German production company gathered the former spies in Germany in order to make a documentary on the Cold War espionage in Europe. At this gathering, Bagley met Sergei Kondrashev, who worked in the Russian intelligence for almost 50 years, from 1944 until 1992. In other words, Kondrashev's career spanned from the years of Stalin to the years of Yeltsin and covered the entire period of the Cold War. One can easily imagine how many secrets Kondrashev was acquainted with. In 1997, Kondrashev, as a senior KGB officer in Berlin in the 1950s and the 1960s, and David Murphy, a senior CIA officer in Berlin during the same time, together with the journalist George Bailey, co-authored a fascinating book on the US-Soviet Cold War spy games in Berlin under the title Battleground Berlin: CIA versus KGB in the Cold War, which became something of a spy bestseller. Soon afterwards, according to Epstein, Kondrashev began working on his memoirs and contacted Bagley to solicit his help. Bagley, who had earlier co-authored the book on the KGB Masters of the Soviet Union, with the KGB defector Peter Deryabin, accepted. In the period from 2000 until 2006, Kondrashev and Bagley would occasionally meet in Brussels, where Bagley lived, to work on the book project. However, when the manuscript was ready for publication in 2007, the SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence agency, changed its mind and refused to allow the publication. Not surprisingly, this was a shattering blow for Kondrashev. He died later the same year at the age of 84. According to Epstein, having received the permission of Kondrashev's family, Bagley decided to go ahead with the publication of the book in the United States against the wishes of the SVR. And so, let's take a closer look at the materials that the Russian intelligence does not want us to know, as revealed by one of its own former top spymasters, Sergei Kondrashev. What is there to cause their concern? Sources and methods, perhaps? Let's investigate. In my opinion, the first chapter of the book contains the most surprising and historically significant revelation in the entire book. Kondrashev claims that he recruited a U.S. code clerk from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in 1948. This code clerk provided enough information to the Soviet cipher specialists to construct a replica of the U.S. cipher machine and read all the secret U.S. military cables to and from the U.S. Embassy. In other words, the Soviets were reading the U.S. intelligence like an open book in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. According to Kondrashev, the deciphered messages were delivered directly to Stalin via the head of the Ministry of State Security, which was renamed the KGB in 1954, Viktor Abakumov. Bagley speculates that it was precisely this information that made it clear to Stalin that the US would not attack the Soviet Union if the Soviets decided to assist the North Korean invasion of the South. In other words, Stalin could confidently send in the Soviet troops, which he did, without the fear of the direct US retaliation. Bagley concludes that one of the guiltiest parties for the outbreak of the Korean War was this US spy. Now, who was this spy? Kondrashev never revealed his identity. Indeed, the spy was never identified. All that is known at this time is that his code name was Jack. This information was revealed by the Soviet defector Anatoly Golitsyn in 1961, but he did not know the spy's real name. In this chapter, however, Kondrashev describes how he recruited Jack. It was the case of the honey trap. Jack was seeing a Russian girl who was already known to the KGB. In other words, she might have been one of the so-called KGB swallows trained to entrap the foreigners of interest to the Soviet state. Kondrashev got her to introduce him to Jack, and he reported to his superiors, the counterintelligence chief Yevgeny Pitovranov and the minister Abakumov, that Jack's case looked promising. It turned out that Jack was greedy and wanted to get rich quickly. Kondrashev began meeting with him more frequently and giving him more and more money. He first started with general questions and then moved to the specific areas that the KGB wanted to know about. Jack answered all the questions and even brought some broken parts of the US cipher machines used in the embassy. Kondrashev was soon joined by Misha, a cipher specialist working for the Ministry of State Security. Soon, the Soviets could construct a replica of the cipher machine and begin reading all the US secret messages. By this time, Jack was given $50,000, and before he left the Soviet Union, was rewarded by the minister Abakumov with additional $50,000. This was an enormous amount of money for those days. It is the equivalent of more than $1 million today. Obviously, this was a huge success for the Soviet intelligence. Even Kondrashev benefited from this success. He received an apartment from the government. However, the joy in the ministry was cut short by another Stalin's purge of his real and imagined enemies. He ordered the arrests of the minister Abakumov and the chief Pitovranov. Abakumov, the head of the controversial and powerful wartime Smersh organization, Death to the Spies, never got out of prison alive. Even Kondrashev had to keep a low profile until sometime after Stalin's death in 1953. In addition, the KGB attempted to re-establish the contact with Jack in the United States, but was not successful. As I said before, the identity of Jack, though he must have passed away years ago, is still a secret. Another very interesting chapter in the book is chapter 5, in which Kondrashev describes his first foreign intelligence assignment in Great Britain. He reports that he was sent to London as a new, unknown face working under the cover of a cultural attaché in the Soviet embassy. The Soviets have had a great deal of success in penetrating the British intelligence, starting with the Cambridge Five, including Kim Philby, in the 1930s. However, by the early 1950s, their covert network started showing a lot of strain. Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean were exposed and had to escape to Moscow, while Philby was demoted and put under surveillance. Obviously, it was not an easy time for Kondrashev. He had a lot of challenges to deal with. He claims that he was put in charge of Harry Houghton, who was spying for the Soviets in the British Admiralty. In addition, Kondrashev delivered money to the British Communist Party chief Harry Pollitt for the publication of a communist newspaper and other expenses. He says that the sums contained from $10,000 to $20,000 and were delivered twice a year. That's close to $500,000 a year according to today's exchange rate. Not a bad subsidy from the Soviets, don't you agree? Most importantly, Kondrashev reports that while in London, he kept in touch with George Blake, whose real name was George Behar, a high-level British diplomat who was recruited to work for the Soviets while he was held in prison by the North Koreans during the Korean War. The description of his meetings with Blake sounds like the stuff straight from the spy movies, brush passes, brief encounters on buses and in movie theaters. According to Kondrashev, Blake gave him the plans for the construction of the secret US and UK underground tunnels for eavesdropping on the Soviet military communications near Berlin and Vienna. In other words, the KGB knew about the tunnels even before they were constructed. However, in order not to expose Blake, the Soviet military was told only in general terms, especially regarding the Vienna tunnel, and the KGB rarely used the tapped phones to pass on this information. For a long time, neither the CIA nor the MI6 knew that their secret channel was an open book for the KGB. In 1961, Blake was uncovered as the Soviet spy by the Polish defector Michael Goleniewski. It turned out that it was the CIA's Bagley who uncovered him. Blake was arrested by the British authorities and sentenced to 42 years in prison. However, in 1966, he was able to escape from Britain into East Germany, where he met with Kondrashev again. Blake was transported to Moscow, where he lives to this day on the KGB pension. He is 94 years old. Another interesting chapter of the book is chapter 10, in which Bagley discusses the KGB's links to the Nazi underground. However, in this chapter, Kondrashev does not offer much in the way of evidence. He only reports certain fleeting conversations that he had in the late 1950s with the longtime chief of the KGB illegals in Western Europe, Alexander Korotkov. Kondrashev claims that in 1945, the Soviet forces, that is Abakumov's Smersh, arrested the Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller and used him in the post-war period to infiltrate the Western ex-Nazi underground. According to this account, the KGB had its own people in the Nazi community in Latin America, as well as within the network of Reinhard Gehlen, who became the first chief of the West German intelligence agency, the BND. This is yet another thing that gave the KGB an important advantage over the Western intelligence community. Interestingly, Bagley claims that the books purporting that the US forces arrested Mueller and made him cooperate with the US NATO intelligence agenda are based on falsified accounts and have been financed by the Soviet government. Specifically, he mentions the book by Gregory Douglas, whose real name, according to Bagley, is Peter Stahl, entitled Gestapo Chief, the 1948 interrogation of Heinrich Müller, which can be found on the internet. In contrast, Bagley praises the account of the Mueller case presented in the book by his friend, the veteran French intelligence officer Pierre de Villemarest, entitled Untouchable: Who Protected Bormann and Gestapo Mueller After 1945, published in 2005. In this book, the KGB, and not the CIA, is described as the main puppet master of the ex-Nazi intelligence officers in the post-war Europe. Obviously, this is something that does not square with the official account of the Soviet and Russian government's relations toward the defeated Nazis. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why the Russian intelligence did not give its permission for the publication of Kondrashev's memoirs. Lastly, Bagley devotes several chapters of the book to Kondrashev's accounts of the Soviet deception games, known in the KGB terminology as active measures. For many years, Kondrashev was in the top leadership of the KGB Section A, in charge of designing and implementing these measures. Initially, he worked under the command of Ivan Agayans, a veteran intelligence officer who at one time was the KGB resident in Paris. An extremely skillful operative, Agayans had many highly placed agents and sources, most of whom were never discovered. According to Kondrashev, active measures are different from disinformation because the leaked information could be true, but very embarrassing for the other side. He claims that the main goal of the Soviet active measures was to cause distrust and conflict among the Western allies, to amplify political and social divisions, to break up NATO, and to get the US military out of Western Europe. For instance, the Soviets made efforts to discredit the US Strategic Air Command personnel and were successful in discrediting the NATO Secretary General Joseph Luns, who was subsequently forced to retire. The KGB also targeted various West German and NATO military figures with personal attacks about their past. According to Kondrashev, the KGB ran hundreds of operations of this kind every year. It typically used sympathizers and not paid agents in order to make its influence more difficult to trace and also make it easier to maintain plausible deniability. One of its most frequent activities was planting propaganda articles in the Western newspapers. In addition, many journalists in the state-run news agency Novosti worked under its supervision. Moreover, according to Kondrashev, the KGB had an excellent forging sections and could fake any document, signature, or passport. Sometimes the KGB would even try to push its opponents into the wasteful lines of research. Kondrashev claims that such was the focus on parapsychology, psychics, and remote viewing, which we know now beyond any doubt that both the CIA and the DIA engaged in. Apparently, they were fooled by the KGB's active measures. In the end, according to Kondrashev, even though the KGB had a significant intelligence advantage over the CIA, the Soviet Union fell apart due to what he calls the major strategic miscalculations by the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. His reforms were much too hasty and disorganized, and instead of reforming the system, led to its collapse. Kondrashev states that Yuri Andropov, one of the Gorbachev's predecessors and the longtime chief of the KGB, would have done a much better job had he not succumbed to a fatal illness in 1984. As far as his own long-time service in the KGB, Kondrashev states that he did all he did not for the Communist Party or the Soviet economic model, but for Russia. He posits patriotism and the service to the motherland as his only motivations. However, it appears that the contemporary Russian intelligence community disagrees, and that had it not been for the ex-CIA's Bagley, Kondrashev's biography, and lifelong intelligence exploits would have remained completely unknown to the public. Just like many other spy masters, he would have disappeared into the abyss of anonymity. Dear friends, that's all in this pilot edition of the Tales from the Russian Intelligence. Thank you for watching and for being a supporter of Newsbud. Be cool and stay cool until the next edition.
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.